On the afternoon of Wednesday, the 12th of April 2006, a dentist named Dr. John Yelnick was finishing up with his last patient of the day. He was working at his practice in the small rural community of Blairsville, Pennsylvania. He gave the patient a new toothbrush, a friendly smile, and told her to come back in 6 months for her next checkup. After she left, he walked into his back office and started to pack up his things for the day. Once he had everything, he walked back out through the empty reception area. He saw his receptionist getting ready to leave and told her to have a great night. She smiled and waved back as he walked out the door. But as soon as that door closed behind him, the smile completely vanished from John's face. The truth was, he was pretending. Pretending to be happy all day at work was becoming more and more exhausting. In reality, his life was filled with problems, and he was struggling under the weight of it all. He walked across the parking lot, got into his car, and started the short half-mile drive from his office to his house. John had grown up in Blairsville. It was his hometown, and it had always been his dream to build a life and raise a family right there. When he graduated from dental school 13 years earlier, he could have easily moved to a big city. He probably would have made a lot more money right away. But that wasn't what he wanted. Instead, he chose to come back home and join the practice of the very same dentist who had looked after his teeth when he was a kid. And it turned out to be a great decision. John's practice became incredibly successful. He had a natural charm, and he was especially good with children, which made his office a popular choice for families all over the area. He started making a lot more money than he ever expected. He was smart with it, too. He took the extra income and invested it in real estate. By the time he was in his 30s, John Yelnick was a millionaire. But for John, true success wasn't about the money. He felt like his life was truly complete when he met a woman named Michelle. Michelle was a single mother with 2 kids of her own. For John, this was perfect. It meant he was getting a ready-made family, something he'd always wanted. Some of his friends were a little worried. They quietly suggested that maybe Michelle was just interested in him for his money. But John never believed that. And any doubt he might have had disappeared when his own mother got sick with cancer. Michelle stepped up without a second thought and became his mother's full-time caregiver. To John, that was all the proof he needed. It showed him that Michelle's love for him was real. So, in 1997, John and Michelle got married. Shortly after, they decided to adopt a little boy together, who they named JJ. With Michelle's 2 children and now JJ, they had a big bustling family of 5. They moved into a beautiful large house with a swimming pool and a hot tub in the backyard. From the outside, and for a while on the inside, it seemed like they had the perfect life. But now, as John pulled his car into the driveway of a different, much more modest house, he just sat there for a moment, staring at it. This was where he lived now. And he couldn't help but wonder how everything had fallen apart so completely, so quickly. The big house with the pool was a distant memory. These days, John was struggling with money. He'd always been a generous person, and he had loaned tens of thousands of dollars to various people over the years. But now, he was in the uncomfortable position of having to ask for that money back simply because he needed it to get by. His marriage was in an even worse state. He and Michelle had hit a rough patch that just never ended. It got to a point where they both admitted to having affairs. They were now living separately, which is why John was here at this small, quiet house instead of the family home he had built with so much hope. But the financial stress and the pain of his failing marriage were not the worst things in John's life. There was a third, much darker stressor that was consuming him. For the past couple of weeks, John had become absolutely convinced that someone was trying to kill him. It all started about 2 weeks earlier when he found his car had been vandalized. Someone had covered it in spray paint. The police came and took a report, but they couldn't find any suspects. Logically, having your car spray painted doesn't automatically mean someone wants to murder you. But John couldn't shake the feeling that this was different. It felt deeply personal, like a direct message. He felt like he was being targeted. Over the next few days, that feeling grew from a small worry into a full-blown conviction. He was so sure that his life was in danger that he took a drastic step. He went to his attorney's office and gave her $10,000 in cash. He told her that if he ended up dead, she should use that money to investigate his murder. John finally got out of his car, walked up the porch steps, and went inside his lonely house. He closed the door and locked it behind him, a habit he'd developed recently. The silence inside was overwhelming. It only amplified how depressing the small house felt. He wished his son JJ was there. When JJ was around, the whole house felt alive and full of energy. But with the separation, John didn't get to see his son very much anymore. Sometimes, long stretches of time would pass between their visits, and John missed him terribly. He took off his shoes and walked into the living room. There, on the coffee table, was a stack of legal documents he'd been trying to ignore. They were divorce papers. Michelle had actually filed for divorce 3 years earlier, back in 2003, but the process had dragged on and on. They hadn't been able to reach an agreement. To be clear, they weren't fighting to save the marriage. That was long over. In fact, Michelle was already living with a new boyfriend, a Pennsylvania state trooper named Kevin Foley. The one thing they were fighting over, the reason the divorce had stalled for 3 years, was their adopted son, JJ. Michelle wanted full custody, and John was fighting with everything he had to not let that happen. He couldn't bear the thought of losing his son. But John knew that in less than 24 hours, this long, painful battle would finally be over. Their lawyers had at last worked out a shared custody agreement. Michelle had already signed her part of the paperwork. The next day, it would be John's turn to sign. He sat down on the couch and flicked on the TV, but he couldn't focus on it. He felt restless, on edge. He picked up the phone and called his aunt, who he was very close to. They talked for a while about the divorce and the custody agreement. He told her how relieved he was that it was almost over. When they finally said their goodbyes, John hung up the phone. He laid down on the couch, not even bothering to go to his bedroom, and soon he drifted off to sleep. The next afternoon, around 3:30 p.m., a 9-year-old boy named Zach Use walked out of his house and across the lawn towards John's house next door. Zach was hoping to see if John's son, JJ, was home and wanted to play. He knew JJ split his time between his mom's and dad's houses, so it was always a bit of a guess whether he'd be there. But as Zach got to the front steps of John's house, he stopped dead in his tracks. He saw that a small glass panel to the left of the front door was completely shattered. There were shards of glass all over the porch. And underneath the broken panel, he could see streaks of a dark red liquid that had dried on the house and the porch floor. Zach's heart started pounding. He knew instinctively that it was blood. His first impulse was to turn and run as fast as he could back to his own house. But then he thought about his friend, JJ. What if JJ was inside? What if he was hurt or in trouble? Zach felt like he couldn't just leave without making sure. So, mustering up all his courage, the little boy slowly walked up the rest of the steps. He tried the doorknob, but it was locked. So, being as careful as he could not to cut himself, Zach reached his small hand through the broken glass panel. He felt around on the inside, found the lock, and turned it. He pushed the door open and took a hesitant step inside. The first thing he saw was chaos. Papers were scattered everywhere across the floor of the foyer. And then he saw it. Lying motionless on the floor, in the middle of all the papers, was a body. It was covered in blood. At that moment, all of Zach's courage vanished. He turned around and ran out of the house, screaming for help. About 15 minutes later, Corporal Janelle Lead of the Blairsville Borough Police Department was in her car with her husband and their 4 children. Her radio crackled to life with a call from dispatch. A 911 call had come in from a normally quiet residential street. The details were a bit vague. Dispatch told her it was a possible cardiac arrest and that her presence was needed at the scene. That was all the information they had. Thinking it was just a routine medical call, maybe an elderly person having a heart attack, Corporal Lyde drove her family straight to the address. But the moment she pulled up and got out of her car, she knew this was no cardiac arrest. A patrol officer was waiting for her on the front porch, and his face was grim. As she walked up to him, he pointed to the shattered glass panel and the dark stains on the porch. She asked him what was going on, saying she'd been told it was a heart attack. The officer just looked at her and said, "You know what? It's probably best if you just go in and look for yourself." Lead turned and gave a quick, reassuring wave to her husband and kids, trying to signal that everything was fine and she'd just be a minute. Then she stepped through the front door. The scene that greeted her was shocking. The entire foyer was splashed with blood. It was on the floor, on the walls, everywhere. And there, in the middle of it all, surrounded by those scattered papers, was a man's body. It was the most brutally mutilated body she had ever seen in her entire career. Now, Corporal Lyde had never actually worked a homicide case before. But as she stood there, trying and failing to count the number of stab wounds on the victim, she knew one thing for certain. This was not a heart attack. This was a murder. And it was now her first case. She also realized she was in a potentially dangerous situation. Because the call had been mistakenly logged as a cardiac arrest, a full police response hadn't been sent. It was just her and the one patrol officer on the scene. For all she knew, the killer could still be somewhere inside the house. And her entire family was sitting in a car just a few feet away. She immediately ordered the patrol officer to clear the rest of the house to make sure no one else was inside. Then she went back outside and stood in the front yard, positioning herself between the house and her family's car, her hand resting on the butt of her gun. It was a terrifying few minutes, but luckily she soon heard the sound of approaching sirens in the distance. At the same time, the patrol officer came back out of the house. He told her it was empty. The killer was gone. The only other thing he had found was a huge puddle of blood in the basement where it had soaked through the floorboards from the foyer above. At this point, more officers were arriving. Lade told her husband to take the kids and go home. She kissed them goodbye and then switched back into detective mode. She went back inside the house to begin her investigation. It was around this time that another officer told her the victim's name. It was Dr. John Yelnick. As crime scene technicians began the painstaking work of collecting evidence, Corporal Lead started her own slow, methodical walkthrough of the home. She wanted to get a sense of who John was and figure out exactly what happened to him. John's body was near the front door, but it was obvious that the attack had been long and chaotic. There was blood spattered all over the living room, which was where the scattered divorce papers were. John's body was barefoot. However, there were several bloody shoe prints in the house that were clearly not his. They were far too large to belong to Zach, the little boy who found him. Lead figured they must belong to the killer. The crime scene techs were already measuring the prints, trying to determine the shoe size. As she continued her search, she didn't see anything that looked like an obvious murder weapon. She also saw no signs of a robbery. The television was still there, electronics were untouched, and no drawers or cabinets seemed to have been ransacked. This made sense to her. The sheer violence of the attack suggested it was deeply personal. The killer hadn't come here to steal anything. They had come for one reason only, to make sure John Yelnick died a horrible death. She finished her sweep of the house and ended up back in the living room, which she believed was where the attack had started. That's when she noticed a check sitting on the coffee table right next to some of the divorce papers. The check was made out to John Yelnick for $15,000. Attached to it was a handwritten note. The note asked John to please wait a few days before he deposited the check. The check and the note were signed by someone named Melissa Yuse. When Lead saw the last name, she did a double take. Yuse. That was the last name of the little boy, Zach, who had found the body. She wondered if Melissa Yuse was related to him, maybe his mother. In that moment, Corporal Lead realized she had her first two solid leads. Her victim was in the middle of a very messy divorce. And someone, possibly his next-door neighbor, owed him a lot of money that they apparently didn't have right at that moment. It was getting dark by the time Lead finally stepped back outside the house. A crowd had gathered on the street, a mix of curious neighbors and reporters. Murders were extremely rare in Blairsville, and she knew this was going to be a huge story. She just wanted to get back to the station and start organizing her thoughts for the interviews she needed to conduct. But before she could leave, another officer approached her with an update. Police had been going door to door, talking to the neighbors to see if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. And they had come back with two very interesting pieces of information. The first came from a woman who said that the previous night, around 1:30 in the morning, she was woken up by the sound of a scream. She said she sat up in bed and listened, but the screaming didn't continue, so she eventually just went back to sleep. The second piece of information came from another neighbor who also heard something around that same time. This neighbor heard a man yelling like he was in a very heated argument. They couldn't make out most of what was being said, but they heard one sentence yelled very clearly, "I'll never loan you money again." As soon as Lead heard that, her mind went straight back to the $15,000 check on the coffee table. This seemed to support the theory that the murder was about money. But the officer wasn't finished. He said there was one more thing. In addition to those witness statements, several of John's neighbors had told the police that there was one particular family on the block that detectives really needed to look into. And that was the Use family. Because, according to neighborhood gossip, Melissa Use and John Yelnick had been having an affair. The next day, April 14th, Corporal Lead was at the police station. She was sitting in an interrogation room across a small table from Melissa Use and her husband, Tom. This was Lead's first murder case, but she was a very methodical person. She had a clear plan. She was going to question Melissa and Tom very aggressively, even though in her mind they weren't her top suspects. Her number 1 and 2 suspects were John's estranged wife, Michelle, and her new boyfriend, Kevin Foley. She knew from her training that in a murder investigation, a divorcing spouse and their new partner are always the first people you look at. The night before, Lead had sent an officer to Michelle's house to inform her of John's death. But when the officer arrived, Michelle already knew. She told the officer she had heard that John died of a heart attack. The officer then had to deliver the difficult news that it was not a heart attack, it was a murder. According to his report, both Michelle and her boyfriend Kevin seemed genuinely shocked and upset by this. Corporal Lead actually knew Kevin Foley personally. He was a state trooper, and they had even worked together on cases in the past. Now, she was faced with the very awkward and sensitive task of investigating a fellow police officer. It was a very tricky situation. So, her plan was to gather as much information as she could before she confronted Michelle and Kevin. She wanted to try and rule out the Uses first. She was also waiting for the results of the autopsy, which was scheduled for later that day. Now, sitting in the interrogation room, she looked at Melissa and Tom. She started by asking them about the $15,000 check. Melissa answered in a shaky voice. She explained that she and John had been good friends since they were in 9th grade. She was planning to open a new bakery in town, and John, being the generous person he was, had loaned her the money to help her get started. But then, she said, he had suddenly asked for the money back. Melissa said she was a little disappointed, but she also knew he was going through a very expensive divorce, so she understood. She explained that when she wrote the check, she only had $14,000 in her bank account. That's why she left the note, asking him to wait a few days before cashing it so she could get the last $1,000 together. Lade watched Melissa very closely as she spoke. She seemed genuinely devastated by John's death. The issue with the money seemed like a minor detail to her compared to the loss of her friend. The obvious warmth Melissa felt for John raised another, more sensitive question. Lade decided she couldn't avoid it, even with Melissa's husband sitting right there. She looked directly at Melissa and asked her bluntly, "Were you having an affair with John?" Melissa's face immediately turned red. She stammered and said, "No, absolutely not." She insisted they were just very close friends, nothing more. At this point, Lead turned her attention to Melissa's husband, Tom. She asked him the same question. Was his wife having an affair with John? For a moment, Tom was completely silent. When he finally spoke, he didn't sound angry. He just seemed incredibly nervous. He completely avoided the question. Instead, he just kept repeating that he really needed to go, that he had to take care of his kids. Lead knew it was a blunt question, but Tom's reaction was extremely suspicious. By the time the interview was over and she let them go, Tom Hughes had firmly established himself in her mind as a serious person of interest. Before she left the station for the day, Lead checked in with the officer she had sent to observe the autopsy. He told her that the forensic pathologist had determined the killer used a knife with a one-sided blade to slash John repeatedly. In addition to the stab wounds, John's jugular vein had been severed by a piece of glass. He also had numerous defensive wounds on his hands and arms and cuts on his back, which suggested that at some point he had tried to run away from his attacker. Lead already knew the murder was brutal, but hearing the clinical details from the autopsy report reinforced just how violent and personal it was. Her first thought was that whoever did this must have truly hated John. And she already had a suspect, Tom Hughes, who had a powerful motive for hate, a potential affair between his wife and the victim. Despite her inexperience with homicide cases, Lead felt confident. She believed that if she was just allowed to work the case her way, slowly and methodically, she would be able to solve it. But she also knew that the case was getting a lot of media attention. There would be immense pressure from her superiors and the public to get results quickly. If she moved too slowly, she worried the case might be taken away from her, or another, larger police agency might be brought in to help. She didn't want that to happen, but she also refused to compromise her careful process. She would have to find a balance. The officer who observed the autopsy had brought back several evidence containers from the medical examiner's office. They contained John Yelnick's fingernail clippings, blood samples, and other tissue samples. Standard procedure was for Lead to immediately send these off to the State Police Crime Lab for DNA testing. But as she held those samples, she made a decision. She was not going to do that. She wanted to keep all of her options open. She needed to maintain complete control over every single piece of evidence in this case. So, after the other officer left, Corporal Lyde walked over to the department's evidence refrigerator, placed the container of samples inside, closed the door, and went home for the night. The next day was April 15th, 2 days after the murder. By this point, Corporal Lyde had spoken to a number of John's friends and family members. They all painted a similar picture of him. They said he was a great guy, a generous friend, and above all, a very dedicated father. Today, Lead was heading to John's dental practice to speak with his colleagues. She wanted to see if they had a different perspective, and she was glad she did. As soon as she arrived, the dental hygienist and the receptionist had a lot to say, and it was all about John's estranged wife, Michelle. They told her that during the long 3-year divorce battle, Michelle had made some very serious allegations against John. She had accused him of abusing their adopted son, JJ. The accusations were investigated, and even Michelle's own family didn't believe her. Officials ultimately declined to press any charges against John. But at one point, Michelle accused John of violating a stay-away order, and the police had come to the dental office and arrested him in front of his staff and patients. To John's colleagues, Michelle was a nightmare. They said she also called the office all the time, demanding money, and John would usually give in just to keep the peace. But, according to one of the hygienists, Michelle had called just a few days before the murder, and that time, for the first time, John had refused to even take her call. This detail immediately caught Lead's attention. It wasn't just his colleagues who described Michelle as being obsessed with money. Many of John's friends said the same thing. They said it was Michelle who had pushed for the big flashy house with the pool. John had never been comfortable with that kind of lifestyle. To his friends, it was this fundamental difference between them that ultimately drove them apart. Lade started to piece together a possible motive. Maybe John and Michelle had a major fight about money just days before he was killed. Michelle calls, demands money, and John finally says no. Could that have been the final straw? Could that have pushed Michelle to do something drastic? Maybe. But Lead also learned something else. Michelle was still listed as the primary beneficiary on John's life insurance policy. If he died, she stood to inherit millions of dollars. So now there was a powerful two-pronged financial motive for Michelle to want John out of the picture. But there was a problem with this theory. It seemed unlikely that Michelle, on her own, would have been able to physically overpower a grown man like John and inflict such horrific injuries. It seemed more likely that John would have been able to fight her off. But then Lead considered another possibility. Maybe Michelle didn't do it herself. Maybe she hired someone to do it for her. Someone bigger, stronger. And with the potential of millions of dollars in insurance money, she certainly would have been able to afford it. As Lead left the dental office, she started to think about how she would approach her interview with Michelle and her state trooper boyfriend, Kevin Foley. Given the sensitivity of investigating another cop, she knew she couldn't make a move without having all her facts in order. This wasn't just her first murder case, it was the biggest case of her career. The media was calling her non-stop. She was determined not to screw it up. John Yelnick's funeral was held on Wednesday, April 19th, 6 days after his murder. Corporal Lead knew that his friends and family were growing frustrated. To them, it seemed like the investigation was moving at a snail's pace. Lead understood their impatience. The case was under a huge public microscope from day one. And there was the strange fact that John himself had been paranoid that he was going to be murdered. It was either a bizarre coincidence or a chilling premonition. But Lead felt that the family didn't understand what she was doing. She wasn't just being slow, she was being careful. That was her process. Without any official guidance on how to run a homicide investigation, she was developing her own careful, methodical system, and for the next several months, she stuck to it. The crime lab hadn't found any usable fingerprints or foreign DNA at the crime scene. The bloody shoe prints didn't match any of her initial suspects. So, for the time being, her investigation relied almost entirely on interviews. She chased down every single tip and rumor, no matter how small, and systematically ruled them out one by one. And all the while, she kept a close watch on her three main suspects, Tom Yuza, Kevin Foley, and Michelle Yelnick. But she made no move to arrest anyone. The public complaints, and especially the criticism from John's own family, sometimes got to her. But she was convinced she was on the right path. She just needed more time. That was until Melissa Use decided to hire a pair of psychics. It was the summer of 2006, about 3 months after the murder. Lead got a call from Melissa. She was surprised to hear from her, and even more surprised when Melissa asked to meet at John's house. When Lead arrived, Melissa was standing on the sidewalk, but she wasn't alone. With her were two older women who Melissa introduced as a pair of psychic sisters. She explained that she had met them at a psychic tea party and that they had been having visions about the case. Lead was not happy about this. And she was even less happy when she learned that John's family, desperate for answers, had given the psychics permission to go inside the crime scene. But Lead also knew that John's family was at the end of their rope. If she wanted them to give her more time to conduct her investigation properly, she needed to play along. If that meant working with psychics hired by the wife of one of her suspects, then so be it. So, Lead followed Melissa and the two psychics as they walked into John's front yard. The sisters started talking about feeling hot and cold patches of energy. Lead did her best not to roll her eyes. They then went inside the house, which had been sealed but not yet cleaned. It was still splattered with John's blood. The psychics announced that they had a premonition that the killing had happened in the dining room area. They said they could see a knife and stab wounds and a bloody footprint. They declared that the killer drove a black or red car, and most importantly, they said that the killer was not Melissa's husband, Tom. Melissa seemed very excited by these revelations, but to Lead, it was all ridiculous. The bloodstains all over the house made it pretty obvious where the attack had taken place. The details about the stab wounds and the police investigation had been all over the local news for months. Anyone could have known those things. And the fact that these psychics, who were hired and brought there by Melissa, were now conveniently clearing her husband of any involvement was not convincing at all. As the group finally left the house, the only thing Lead could think was that the psychics had maybe, just maybe, bought her a little more time by taking some of the pressure off. She knew that John's family had completely lost faith in her abilities. But what they didn't know was that she still had an ace up her sleeve. She just had to wait for the perfect moment to play it. Fast forward to February of 2007, 10 months after the murder, Corporal Lead finally got her chance. John's cousins, fed up with the lack of progress, made an official plea to the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office asking them to take over the investigation. Lead's reluctant cooperation with the psychics had bought her some time, but ultimately, John's family and Melissa Hughes had become more and more agitated by her slow pace. They felt the psychics had given them more information than the police had. The Attorney General reviewed the case and agreed. Corporal Lead was being taken off the case. On the surface, this was her worst nightmare. A bigger, more powerful agency was coming in to take over her investigation, just as she had feared. But, on the other hand, the agency taking over was the Attorney General's office, not the state police. And when she realized that, she knew her moment had finally arrived. This was the play she had been waiting almost a year to make. Lead went to the Blairsville police station. She walked to the evidence refrigerator and took out the small sealed container. Inside were the fingernail clippings and tissue samples that had been collected from John Yelnick's body during his autopsy. She had been ordered to send them to the state police crime lab 10 months ago, but she had disobeyed that order. In a total breach of protocol, she had hidden them away and waited. Now, with the Attorney General's office publicly taking over, the case had a much higher profile. It was no longer just a small-town murder. This new status gave Lead the leverage she needed. She could now justify sending the evidence to a much more powerful lab, bypassing the state police entirely. She could send it to the FBI crime lab in Quantico. Normally, the FBI wouldn't get involved in a case like this, but with the Attorney General's involvement, she knew they would accept it. So she carefully repackaged the samples, filled out the new paperwork, and sent the evidence off to the FBI. And then, she waited. The day the results came back, Lead was a nervous wreck. She knew there was a very real chance that her risky gamble was about to backfire, that she was about to look like a fool for sitting on crucial evidence for almost a year. But as she sat at her computer and opened the email from the FBI lab, her eyes widened. She read the report and then read it again. She couldn't believe it. Her strategy of intentionally slow-playing the investigation, of hiding the evidence and waiting for the right moment, had paid off in a way she could have only dreamed of. Finally, after all this time, she was looking at the name of John Yelnick's killer. Based on the evidence collected at the crime scene and the DNA results from the FBI, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened in the early morning hours of the 13th of April, 2006. Around 12:30 a.m., a red car pulled onto John Yelnick's quiet residential street. The driver killed the engine and the headlights, and the car coasted to a stop in front of John's modest brick home. The killer got out and scanned the dark street, making sure no one was watching. The neighborhood was silent. The killer walked around to the back of the house and slipped inside through an unlocked door. Once inside, they moved quietly through the dining room and into the living room. There, they saw John Yelnick, asleep on the couch. The killer was holding a single-edged knife. They walked right up to the couch, raised the knife high, and brought it down hard into John's body. John woke up instantly, screaming in pain and shock. He threw his hands up to defend himself, clawing and scratching at his attacker, managing to get skin and blood from the killer underneath his own fingernails. He thrashed and rolled off the couch, desperate to escape. He managed to get to his feet and stumble away, but the killer was right on him. The two men wrestled and fought in the small living room. The killer stabbed John again and again. During the struggle, one of them knocked into the coffee table, sending the stack of divorce papers flying across the room. Somehow, running on pure adrenaline, John broke free from the killer's grasp. He made a desperate run for the front door, trying to get outside, trying to get help. He made it to the front foyer and reached for the doorknob. But just as his hand touched it, the killer shoved him from behind with tremendous force. John flew forward, and his head crashed through the small pane of glass to the left of the door. A shard of broken glass sliced deep into his neck, severing his jugular vein. John collapsed to the floor and bled to death right there in the foyer. The killer stood and watched until John was completely still. Then they turned, walked back out the way they came in, tracking John's blood across the floor and out the back door. The killer was confident they would never be caught. After all, people trusted this person. They trusted this person with their lives. The killer was Michelle Yelnick's new boyfriend, Pennsylvania State Police Trooper Kevin Foley. The fact that he was a cop was the entire reason Corporal Lead had decided not to send the evidence to the State Police Crime Lab. Lade knew Kevin. She had worked with him and generally liked him. But as her investigation progressed, she kept hearing stories about how much Kevin seemed to hate John. He had apparently believed the false allegations Michelle had made about John abusing JJ even after they were proven to be unfounded. Lead had become increasingly paranoid that if Kevin was the killer, she couldn't risk the state police lab handling the evidence. She worried that evidence could be covered up, either by Kevin himself or by his colleagues trying to protect one of their own. The risk was just too great. So, she made the incredibly risky decision to hide the evidence. She slow-played her investigation for 10 long months, biding her time, waiting for an opportunity to get those samples to a lab she could trust. That opportunity came when the Attorney General's office took over the case, giving her access to the FBI. The FBI scientists found male DNA under John Yelnick's fingernails. And when they ran that DNA through their database, it came back as a direct match to State Trooper Kevin Foley. In the end, Kevin Foley was arrested and found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Michelle Yelnick, she stood to inherit millions from John's death, and her boyfriend was the one who committed the murder. But she was never charged with any crime in connection with the case. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the afternoon of the 2nd of May, 1962, doctors at a small hospital in central Haiti officially declared 40-year-old Clervius Narcisse dead. His sister, Angelina Narcisse, stood beside his bed as a sheet was slowly pulled over his body. Just 2 days earlier, Clervius had been completely healthy. Then, almost overnight, he developed a terrifying fever and began coughing up blood. As Angelina watched him take his final breaths, something about the moment felt wrong. Clervius's eyelids kept twitching, almost like he was still trying to wake up. A horrible rattling sound came from deep in his throat. Then, suddenly, nothing. The doctors pronounced him dead. His family buried him the next day. And everyone believed the story was over. Except, 18 years later, Clervius came back. Not as a rumor. Not as a ghost story. But as a real man standing in the middle of a crowded market, claiming he remembered everything, including the moment he was nailed shut inside his own coffin, But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please tell the like button, you'll help it move next weekend, but then on moving day, you just block its number. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Angelina was devastated, but also confused. The doctors said Clairvius died from malignant hypertension, but they had no idea what caused it to come on so suddenly. The family drama didn't help. Clairvius had inherited all their parents' land and money and refused to help his struggling siblings. Because of this, Angelina was the only one who had shown up at the hospital. The rest of the siblings only appeared for the funeral the next day. They watched as his casket was closed and lowered into the ground. As far as everyone was concerned, the story of Clairvius Narcisse was over. Fast forward 18 years to 1980. Angelina was walking through an outdoor market in her village when a thin, older man approached her. His face was sunken, and a long, deep scar ran from his mouth to his ear. In a gravelly voice, he told her his name was Clairvius and that he was her brother. Angelina was shocked. She thought the man was crazy. This person looked nothing like her brother, and besides, Clairvius was dead. She told the man to leave her alone, but he grabbed her and insisted he was telling the truth. A crowd gathered, and a police officer soon arrived and dragged the man away. At the police station, the man told an absolutely insane story. He claimed that 18 years ago, he wasn't dead, just paralyzed. He said he was mentally aware of everything. He heard the doctor pronounce him dead. He felt the cold of the morgue. He heard them nailing his coffin shut and even felt one of the nails pierce his cheek, which is how he got the scar. He was trapped inside his own body, waiting to suffocate underground. But then, later that night, he felt his coffin being lifted. 2 men pried it open, pulled his body out, and tied him up. They carried him for days into the wilderness until they reached a building in the middle of a huge sugarcane plantation. Inside, an old man, a voodoo priest known as a bokor, poured a liquid into his mouth and started chanting. Slowly, Clairvius found he could move again, but his body felt jerky and uncoordinated. His mind was hazy and slow. The bokor handed him a machete and forced him to work in the fields, alongside dozens of other people who moved in the same strange, unnatural way. He had been turned into a zombie. Clairvius told the police he was forced to work as a slave on that plantation for 2 full years. His ordeal only ended when one of the other workers attacked and killed the bokor. Suddenly, they were all free. But Clairvius didn't go home. He knew the bokor hadn't chosen him randomly, he'd been hired. And Clairvius was certain it was one of his own brothers who paid the bokor to do this, all because of the inheritance dispute. Fearing for his life, Clairvius spent the next 16 years wandering around Haiti, just trying to survive. He only decided to return home after he heard that the brother he suspected had recently died. The police were stunned. The story sounded impossible. But, just in case, they asked Angelina and her siblings for a list of questions that only the real Clairvius could answer: childhood secrets and specific family memories. They sat the man down and asked him the questions, one by one. He answered every single one of them correctly. It really was Clairvius. Years later, a Harvard researcher named Wade Davis investigated the case and uncovered the science behind the story. It's believed Clairvius's brother rubbed a fine powder on his skin. The powder contained tetrodotoxin, a powerful neurotoxin from pufferfish that can induce a death-like state of paralysis with a nearly undetectable heartbeat. This is why doctors thought he was dead. After he was buried, the bokor's men dug him up. The liquid he was forced to drink contained a hallucinogenic plant that kept him in a suggestible, zombie-like state, easy to control and force into slave labor. The brothers' plan was a cruel revenge. But by the time Clairvius returned and told his story, both his brother and the Bokor were long dead. No one was ever brought to justice for the 18 years they stole from him. Clairvius went on to live with his sister, Angelina, and the rest of his family until he passed away for good in 1994. Clairvius Narcisse was declared dead, buried underground, and somehow returned nearly 2 decades later with a story that still feels impossible to explain. Let me know what you think really happened in this case down in the comments. And if you want more strange and mysterious stories like this one, check out the playlist linked on screen. Until next time. The Smiling Boy, the dark reality of Leo Vance. What you are about to hear involves severe psychological manipulation, extreme cruelty, and violence that is deeply disturbing. Viewer discretion is heavily advised. Honestly, out of all the cases I've ever looked into, this one easily sits in my top 3 most unsettling. We all know the Hollywood trope of the troubled child star. Usually, it's a tragic story of exploitation and burnout. But this is completely different. This is the story of a predator hiding in plain sight, protected by a billion-dollar network, a million-watt smile, and our own inability to believe that a child could be fundamentally, irreparably evil. But before we get into it, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, please gently invite the like button to a lovely seafood dinner, order the most expensive lobster, and then sneak out through the bathroom window, leaving the like button stuck with the bill. Also, please subscribe, because we upload once a week, and you won't want to miss it. The year is 2004 in Burbank, California. 28-year-old Sarah Jenkins is exhausted. She's living in a cramped, noisy apartment in North Hollywood, surviving mostly on lukewarm Folgers coffee and the dream of paying off her student loans. Sarah is a licensed studio teacher and on-set social worker. Her job is to ensure that child actors get their required schooling and aren't overworked on set. She's just a normal person. She calls her mom in Ohio every Sunday, she wants to adopt a rescue dog, and she just wants a quiet life. So, when Sarah gets the call in late September to be the dedicated tutor for 10-year-old Leo Vance, she feels like she's won the lottery. If you were alive and watching TV in the early 2000s, you knew Leo Vance. He was the breakout star of the massively popular family sitcom, The Vance Family Rules. On television, Leo was the cheeky, lovable kid next door. He had these big, expressive eyes, a messy mop of blonde hair, and perfect comedic timing. He was universally adored. At first, the job was everything Sarah hoped for. The first few weeks on Stage 22 were a blur of script readings, the smell of sawdust from the set builders, the hum of massive lighting rigs, and a lot of waiting around. Sarah would sit in Leo's private trailer, going over fractions and basic history, and honestly, Leo seemed fine. He was polite, almost too polite. He always said yes ma'am and no ma'am, and he never complained about doing his homework. At the time, this didn't seem strange. Sarah just thought she had lucked into working with a well-behaved kid. But then, on a random Tuesday in October, the illusion started to crack. It was around 11 a.m. Sarah and Leo were in his trailer going over a science worksheet. The trailer's air conditioning was humming loudly, drowning out the noise of the active set outside. A young production assistant, a nervous guy named Mark, who was new to the set, rushed in carrying Leo's lunch. It was a bowl of hot tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich. As Mark set the tray down on the small table, his elbow clipped the bowl. It didn't spill entirely, but a few drops of hot soup splashed onto the edge of Leo's script. Mark immediately panicked. He started apologizing profusely, scrambling for a napkin, his face flushed red. Now, at this point, you'd expect a 10-year-old to either get annoyed, maybe whine to a parent, or just laugh it off. But Leo didn't do any of that. Leo just went completely still. He didn't blink. He just stared at Mark with an expression that Sarah would later describe as absolute freezing emptiness. There was an awkward, heavy silence in the trailer. Sarah shifted in her seat, feeling a strange tightness in her chest, waiting for Leo to react. Then, like a switch was flipped, Leo smiled. It was his trademark television smile. He told Mark it was totally fine, no big deal at all. Mark breathed a massive sigh of relief, thanked him, and left the trailer, clicking the door shut behind him. Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. She smiled at Leo, ready to praise him for being so mature. But before she could speak, Leo calmly picked up the bowl of scalding hot soup. Without breaking eye contact with the closed door, he walked over to where Mark had left his expensive leather messenger bag on the floor. With slow, deliberate precision, Leo poured the entire bowl of steaming soup directly inside the bag, soaking Mark's personal belongings, his phone, and his wallet. Sarah froze. The smell of hot tomato and damp leather filled the small space. She was stunned. Her brain was struggling to process what she was seeing. It was such a quiet, calculated act of malice from a child. "Leo?" Sarah stammered, half standing up from her chair. "What? What are you doing?" Leo slowly turned his head to look at her. The lovable TV kid was gone. His eyes were entirely dead. He looked at the empty bowl in his hands, looked back at Sarah, and in a perfectly flat, robotic voice, he said, "What soup?" He then sat back down, picked up his pencil, and returned to his science worksheet as if nothing had happened. Sarah stood there in the humming quiet of the trailer, her heart suddenly pounding. She tried to rationalize it. Kids are brats. He's under a lot of pressure. It's just a childish, mean prank. She forced herself to sit down, downplaying the alarm bells ringing in her head. But as she watched Leo calmly filling out multiple-choice questions, perfectly at ease next to the ruined bag, Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Because it wasn't the prank that terrified her. It was the absolute lack of emotion. It was the terrifying realization that the child sitting across from her was wearing a mask, and for just a second, she had seen what was underneath. Now, at this point, you have to understand how easy it is to rationalize away red flags when your paycheck depends on it. And honestly, if you've never worked on a television set, you might not realize how incredibly mundane and boring it actually is. It's mostly just sitting around in heavily air-conditioned rooms, drinking stale catering coffee, and waiting. In that environment, you don't expect to be in the presence of a predator. At least, not yet. Over the next few weeks, Sarah convinced herself that the soup incident was just an anomaly. A deeply weird, uncomfortable anomaly, sure, but just a kid acting out under pressure. It helped that Leah went back to being the perfect, charming professional. But there was a lingering tension. It didn't help that Mark, the production assistant whose bag was ruined, ended up getting fired 3 days later. He had thrown a massive, very public fit about his destroyed laptop, and the network executives, protecting their golden goose, simply replaced him. When Mark was escorted off the lot by security, Sarah happened to glance over at Leo. He was sitting in his little customized director's chair, sipping a juice box, watching Mark leave with that same flat, dead expression. But Sarah pushed it down. She had a job to do. Then came the second week of November. The script called for a guest actor, a 12-year-old boy named Toby, who was playing a schoolyard bully. Toby was a loud, boisterous kid, exactly the kind of energetic theater kid you'd expect. He and Leo seemed to get along fine during read-throughs. But on Tuesday afternoon, right before a major scene, production suddenly ground to a halt. Toby had collapsed in the wardrobe trailer. He was having a severe, full-blown allergic reaction. His throat was closing up, his face was swelling, and the set medics had to hit him with an EpiPen and rush him to the hospital. It was total chaos. The director was shouting, the producers were pacing, and Sarah was standing near the snack table feeling completely useless. The prevailing theory was that Toby, who had a known severe peanut allergy, had accidentally eaten a cross-contaminated cookie from craft services. But as Sarah stood there in the humming quiet of the soundstage, something caught her eye. The little plastic labels in front of the catering trays. The label for the macadamia nut cookies and the label for the peanut butter cookies had been swapped. It was a small thing. A simple mistake. Anyone could have bumped the table and knocked them around. But Sarah felt a cold rush of adrenaline hit her chest. She looked across the soundstage. Sitting alone on a wooden apple box, completely untouched by the surrounding panic, was Leo. He was swinging his legs, calmly reading a comic book. At first, Sarah tried to talk to someone. She cornered Leo's mother Brenda near the makeup trailers later that evening. Brenda was a woman who looked like she hadn't slept a full night in 5 years. She was chain-smoking, clutching a lukewarm cup of coffee, looking aged far beyond her years. Sarah gingerly brought up Leo's behavior, the lack of empathy, the strange coldness during Toby's medical emergency, and this is where the false comfort set in. Brenda let out a long, exhausted sigh and rubbed her temples. She told Sarah that Leo was suffering from severe burnout and oppositional defiant disorder. She explained, with tears in her eyes, that Leo's father had recently emptied their bank accounts and abandoned them, and that the network was threatening to cancel the show if ratings dropped. She confessed that Leo was heavily over-medicated on ADHD stimulants just to get through the 12-hour shoot days. It made perfect sense. It was the tragic, logical explanation. Sarah felt a deep wave of guilt for ever suspecting him of anything malicious. He wasn't a monster. He was an abused, exhausted child carrying the financial weight of an entire studio on his tiny shoulders. He was just dissociating. Sarah believed this entirely. Until a rainy Thursday afternoon 3 days later. Leo was on set filming a complicated scene, leaving Sarah alone in his tutoring trailer. She was organizing his schoolwork, filing away his math tests, when she noticed a black faux leather composition notebook wedged behind the mini-fridge. It had slipped off his desk. Assuming it was a journal or a history assignment, Sarah pulled it out and opened it to see where it belonged. What she found completely shattered the fragile narrative of the exhausted, misunderstood child. It wasn't a diary. It wasn't a school assignment. It was a ledger. The pages were filled with Leo's neat, perfect cursive, detailing meticulously drawn maps of the soundstage, schedules of the crew's breaks, and diagrams of where the security cameras were pointed. But it was the lists that made Sarah's blood run cold. He had written down names. Mark's name was there, with a single dark line drawn through it. Below it was written, stimulus, boiling liquid. Target reaction, humiliation, anger. Result, exiled. Sarah's hands started to shake. She flipped the page. Toby's name was there, crossed out. Below it, stimulus, allergen exposure, peanut. Target reaction, asphyxiation, panic. Result, hospitalized. Note, slower than expected. This wasn't a child acting out from stress. This was an experiment. He wasn't lashing out blindly. He was testing the people around him like bugs in a jar, methodically documenting how much pain he could inflict without getting caught. Sarah stood frozen in the trailer, the sound of the rain drumming against the metal roof suddenly sounding deafening. And then she heard the heavy, metallic clunk of the trailer door handle slowly turning. The heavy, metallic clunk of the trailer door handle turning sounded like a gunshot in the tiny, enclosed space. And honestly, in that moment, Sarah didn't think about confronting him. She didn't think about being the hero of this story, or calling the police, or saving the day. The only thing her brain registered was pure primate survival instinct. Her hands scrambled over the desk. She grabbed the black notebook and shoved it violently to the bottom of her oversized canvas tote bag, burying it under a thick stack of graded algebra worksheets just as the door swung open. A gust of cold, wet air blew into the trailer, bringing with it the smell of damp asphalt and stale cigarettes from the crew outside. Leo stepped in. A production assistant holding an umbrella over his head gave a tired wave before pulling the door shut behind him, leaving Sarah and the 10-year-old boy completely alone. Now, at this point, Sarah's heart was hammering so hard against her ribs she thought it might physically bruise her. She tried to arrange her face into a normal, welcoming smile. Leo didn't smile back. He just stood there by the door, rain dripping from the sleeves of his oversized, bright yellow raincoat. He looked small, vulnerable, like a perfectly normal kid who had just been working a grueling 12-hour shift, but Sarah couldn't look at him the same way, because right before she had slammed that notebook shut, she had seen the final page. The ink had still been slightly smeared, like it was written earlier that same morning. It read, Subject, Mother. Stimulus, Threat of emancipation. Financial ruin. Target reaction. Total subservience. Result achieved. And right beneath that, in the same immaculate cursive, subject, father. Stimulus, staged bruising. False allegations, target reaction, retreat. Result, eliminated. His mother hadn't been lying when she said the father abandoned them, but she had lied about why. The father hadn't run away from his responsibilities. He had fled for his life from his own son. Leo slowly unbuttoned his raincoat. He let it drop to the linoleum floor with a wet smack. He didn't say a word. He just walked past Sarah, his small sneakers squeaking against the floorboards, and went straight to the mini-fridge. He stopped. He stared at the gap between the fridge and the wall, the exact spot where the notebook had been. Then, very slowly, Leo turned his head to look at Sarah. I need you to understand how terrifying this moment was. There was no dramatic music. There was just the loud, vibrating hum of the mini-fridge compressor and the drumming of the rain on the metal roof. Leo's face completely changed. The wide-eyed, innocent sitcom expression, the one that had charmed millions of viewers, simply drained away, like water emptying from a sink. What was left behind was an incredibly flat, cold, and calculating stare. It was the face of a middle-aged accountant looking at a spreadsheet error. He didn't look back at the fridge. He looked directly at Sarah's canvas tote bag. "You found my script, Miss Sarah," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. She played dumb, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. "Script? Nobody. I was just organizing your math tests for tomorrow." Leo stared at her for a long, agonizing 5 seconds. He didn't blink. He just tilted his head, studying her face, reading her microscopic tells. "It's okay if you read it," Leo whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. Mommy read hers too. That's why Daddy had to go away. He didn't like his blocking. Sarah didn't say anything else. She didn't try to lecture him. She grabbed her tote bag, her knuckles white, muttered an excuse about feeling nauseous, and walked out of the trailer into the freezing rain. She didn't go home. She drove straight to the production office, marched into the showrunner's trailer, and dropped the black notebook on his desk. She explained everything: Toby's peanut allergy, Mark's scalding, the terrifying entries about his parents. She expected the showrunner to be horrified. She expected production to halt. But this is where the ugly, messy reality of the world comes in. The showrunner didn't gasp. He didn't call the police. He just let out a long, exhausted sigh, rubbed his tired eyes, and flipped through the pages. "Look, Sarah," the showrunner said, sliding the notebook into his top drawer. "He's an imaginative kid under a massive amount of pressure. He's just venting, writing weird, dark stuff. I'll have a talk with his mom, maybe get him a therapist. But we have 3 weeks left of shooting, and I am not shutting down a $50 million production over a kid's edgy diary." He didn't care. He probably knew deep down that something was horribly wrong, but the financial machinery of the network was too big to stop. The truth was inconvenient. Sarah quit right then and there. She walked away from her final paycheck, changed her phone number, and moved back to her home state of Oregon. She left the entertainment industry entirely and took a quiet, mundane job tutoring kids at a local public library. She spent months jumping at every loud noise, constantly checking her rearview mirror, terrified that a 10-year-old boy was somehow going to find her. But he didn't. The fear eventually faded into a dull, lingering ache. Until 3 years later. Sarah was sitting in her small apartment on a Tuesday morning, drinking stale coffee and scrolling through a news aggregate site on her phone when a headline made her blood run entirely cold. Former child star Leo redacted, tragically orphaned after mother's fatal fall. The article detailed how Leo's mother, Margaret, had apparently tripped at the top of their home's wooden staircase in the middle of the night, breaking her neck. The police had ruled it a tragic freak accident. Sarah's hands trembled as she clicked on the embedded video. It was footage from the local news covering the memorial service. Leo was 13 now. Taller, dressed in a sharp black suit. He was standing at a podium outside a church, surrounded by morning network executives and paparazzi. Tears were streaming down his face. He delivered a heartbreaking, perfectly articulated eulogy about how his mother was his rock, his guiding light, and how he didn't know how he was going to survive without her. The reporters in the background were audibly weeping. It was a masterful performance. But as Leo stepped away from the podium, wiping his eyes with a tissue, the cameraman zoomed in slightly, trying to catch one last emotional shot. For a fraction of a second, Leo thought he was off camera. Sarah watched the screen, unable to breathe. The tears stopped instantly. His face went entirely dead. He looked over at his new legal guardian, his wealthy talent agent, and his lips twitched into the tiniest, coldest little smirk. The exact same look he gave right before the boiling water spilled. His ultimate experiment was complete, and he had gotten away with it. If you found this story deeply unsettling, please gently tap the like button, or else tonight I will sneak into your house, bypass your security system, and replace all of your family portraits with framed, glossy photographs of Danny DeVito aggressively eating a hard-boiled egg. The Trunk, dead end in South Beach. There is a very specific smell that bakes into the upholstery of a car when it is left sitting in the sun. If you have ever lived in Florida, you know it. It is a mix of hot plastic, old leather, and trapped, stagnant air. But on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon in late August, with the temperature pushing 98 degrees, the smell coming from the silver 2018 Mercedes-Benz S-Class, parked behind a defunct strip mall off Route 1, was not just hot leather. It was sweet, cloying, heavy. A local security guard, a guy named Rick, who was just doing his rounds, noticed the car first. It was parked across two spots, completely out of place next to the rusted-out dumpsters and cracked asphalt. He walked up to it, maybe 10 feet away, and saw the flies. A thick, buzzing cloud of them swarming the seams of the trunk. Rick did not open it. He called it in. And honestly, thank God he did. Because what the Miami-Dade police found when they finally popped that trunk, it is the kind of thing that sticks with an investigator for the rest of their career. Inside, folded like a discarded piece of luggage, was the owner of the car. To understand how a man ends up dead in the trunk of his own six-figure luxury sedan, you have to understand how he lived. His name was Laurent Dubois. He was 34. A French expatriate who had relocated to Miami a few years prior, bringing with him a seemingly bottomless trust fund and a taste for the absolute finest things in life. Laurent was, for lack of a better word, a playboy. He was the guy you would see at the exclusive clubs in South Beach buying $2,000 bottles of champagne just to spray them into the crowd. He lived in a sprawling 4,000 square foot penthouse overlooking Biscayne Bay. But he was not just a caricature. Friends described him as charming, fiercely loyal, and generous to a fault. He had this habit of paying for everyone's dinner, sliding his black Amex across the table before anyone else could even reach for their wallets. He loved vintage espresso machines, wore a custom cologne that smelled like cedar and sea salt, and had a laugh that could fill a room. He was untouchable, or at least that is the illusion money buys you. He floated through life, insulated by wealth, beautiful women, and fast cars. Which brings us to the weekend before the Mercedes was found. It started on a Sunday. Laurent had a standing brunch reservation at an upscale bistro in Brickell at 11:30 a.m. He never missed it. It was his weekly ritual to detox from whatever Saturday night had been. But that Sunday, his usual table sat empty. His best friend Julian tried calling him around noon. It went straight to voicemail. Not ringing, just dead. Now, at first, Julian did not panic. You know how it is. You figure, hey, it is Laurent. He probably met someone, went back to her place, and his phone died. It is the logical assumption. You always look for the mundane explanation before your brain goes to the dark places. But by Monday morning, Laurent's housekeeper, Maria, arrived at his penthouse. When she stepped off the private elevator, she noticed the front door was slightly ajar. She walked in. The AC was blasting, keeping the massive apartment at a freezing 65 degrees. The recessed lights were still on. On the kitchen island, next to his state-of-the-art espresso machine, was a half-drank cup of coffee. completely cold. His passport was still sitting on the entryway table. Everything was perfectly normal, except Laurent was gone, and the only thing missing from the penthouse were the keys to his Mercedes. At that point, it made sense to think maybe he just went for a late-night drive and got stranded, but honestly, looking at that cold cup of coffee and the heavy oak door left hanging open, Maria felt a knot forming in her stomach. Something was deeply wrong. Maria didn't wait. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and dialed 911. When Miami-Dade PD arrived, they did the standard walkthrough. You know how these things go. They're looking for the obvious. Signs of forced entry, a struggle, blood. But the 4,000 square foot penthouse was pristine. The only sound was the low hum of the central AC fighting the oppressive 90-degree Florida heat outside. But then, the detectives pulled the building's security footage, and honestly, watching that tape, it gives you chills. It's 2:14 a.m. on Monday morning. Laurent steps into the private elevator. He's not dressed for a night out in South Beach. He's wearing a loose white linen shirt and sweatpants. He looks tired. He keeps checking his phone, staring at the screen like he's waiting for a message that isn't coming. The elevator doors open to the subterranean parking garage. 2 minutes later, camera 4 catches his black Mercedes S63 AMG pulling out past the security gate and disappearing into the humid Miami night. So, where did he go? At first, the police went with the most logical theory. You look at a guy like Laurent, flashy, European, driving a $150,000 car with a Rolex on his wrist, and you think, crime of opportunity, a carjacking. It happens. You stop at a red light in the wrong part of town, someone puts a Glock to your window, and that's it. But detectives also found something else. Digging through his bank statements, they noticed a massive cash withdrawal just 3 days prior. 50 grand pulled straight from his trust account. Rumors started swirling around his social circle about a high-stakes underground poker game in Coral Gables. A game where you don't just walk away if you owe the wrong people. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. It all made sense, right? It wasn't a random carjacking. It was a targeted hit over a gambling debt. The police figured Laurent went out at 2 a.m. to pay off a bookie, things went sideways, and they took him out, stole the cash, and dumped the car in a swamp. It was a neat, tidy explanation. It gave the chaos a reason. Until 3 days later. It was a Thursday afternoon when a call came into dispatch. A local business owner reported an abandoned vehicle parked behind a half-empty strip mall off US 1 down near Homestead. It was about 30 miles south of Laurent's penthouse. The car was parked crookedly behind a dumpster, baking in the relentless afternoon sun. It was a black Mercedes S63 AMG. When the detectives pulled up to that dusty, sun-baked lot, they expected to find a shell. If it was a robbery or a gang hit, that car should have been stripped for parts. No rims, no catalytic converter, no stereo. But it wasn't. The car was completely intact. A fine layer of yellow pollen and dust coated the windshield, but the custom wheels were still there. And this is where the whole robbery theory just completely shatters. One of the detectives walked up to the driver's side window, cupped his hands over his eyes to block the glare, and looked through the heavy window tint. Sitting right there on the passenger seat, in plain view, was Laurent's platinum Rolex Daytona. A watch worth easily $40,000. Just sitting there. If someone killed him for money, why leave the watch? The detective tried the door handle. Locked. He walked around to the back of the vehicle, and as he got closer to the rear bumper, he stopped. There's a smell that cops know. You can't unsmell it. It's heavy, sweet, and sickening. And it was seeping out through the rubber weather seals of the trunk, amplified by the 100-degree heat inside the metal body of the car. They popped the trunk. I need you to just pause and picture this for a second. The blinding Florida sun, the sound of traffic humming from the highway, and this horrific, quiet scene behind a discount furniture store. Inside the trunk was Laurent. But he hadn't been robbed. When the forensics team carefully processed the scene, they found his wallet still in the pocket of his sweatpants. It was stuffed with over $2,000 in $100 bills. His black Amex was untouched. The realization hit the detectives like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about a poker game. This wasn't a carjacking gone wrong. The money didn't matter. The car didn't matter. Someone wanted Laurent dead. And worse, they wanted him to be found exactly like this. The medical examiner's report took 2 weeks to come back. And honestly, when the lead detective read it, he had to sit down. He had to physically sit at his desk and just process it. Because Laurent wasn't shot, he wasn't stabbed, there was no blunt force trauma to his skull, no poison in his toxicology report. He died of hyperthermia. Heat stroke, combined with positional asphyxiation, which meant when they closed the trunk of that S63 AMG, Laurent was still alive. You have to understand the sheer horror of that. We're talking about South Florida in mid-July. The temperature inside a black car sitting in direct sunlight can reach 140 degrees in less than an hour. Inside a sealed trunk, it's an oven. The ME found defensive wounds, but not from a fight with a killer. His fingernails were torn, the rubber weather stripping on the inside of the trunk lid was shredded. He had spent hours fighting, clawing, kicking at the metal, screaming into the dark, while cars hummed by on US 1 just a few hundred feet away. So how does a wealthy, physically fit playboy end up locked in his own trunk without a single bruise from a struggle? For weeks, the police chased ghosts. They looked at the business rival in Paris. They looked at the estranged wife. Both had rock-solid alibis, red herrings that ate up hundreds of man-hours. But the truth? The truth was hiding in plain sight, buried in a piece of technology we all carry around without thinking twice. Laurent's phone was never found. But his iCloud was still active. And when cybercrimes finally cracked the location data, they didn't just find out where he had been, they found out who was with him. It wasn't a cartel hitman. It wasn't a jealous husband. It was his personal driver and fixer, a quiet, unassuming guy named Elias. A guy who had been fetching Laurent's dry cleaning, booking his flights, and cleaning up his messes for 5 years. Elias was practically invisible. He was sort of just part of the furniture. But Elias had a secret. Over the last 2 years, he had been quietly siphoning money from a blind trust Laurent had set up for a real estate venture. Not millions, just enough to cover his own gambling debts. A few thousand here, a few thousand there, but Laurent, despite his careless playboy image, was actually meticulous about his ledgers. He had found out. Which brings us to the reconstruction. The present tense play-by-play of what actually happened that Tuesday night. It's 11:45 p.m. Laurent is in the underground parking garage of his penthouse building. He's wearing his sweatpants, relaxed, probably just coming down to grab something from the car. He's not on guard. Why would he be? Elias is waiting by the Mercedes. He tells Laurent there's an issue with the rear suspension, something he needs him to look at. It's a stupid, simple lie. But Laurent trusts him. He walks to the back of the car, he leans over to look, and Elias just pushes him hard. Laurent loses his balance, tumbles forward into the massive deep trunk of the AMG. Before he can even register what's happening, before he can even yell out, Elias slams the heavy trunk lid shut. Click! The electronic lock engages. Elias doesn't panic. He calmly gets into the driver's seat. He turns on some music and drives out of the garage. He drives 30 miles south, listening to the muffled thumps from the back of the car. He parks behind that discount furniture store in Homestead, turns off the engine, and walks away. The $40,000 Rolex sitting on the passenger seat? Laurent had taken it off earlier and left it in the cup holder. Elias deliberately moved it to the seat, leaving it along with the cash in Laurent's pockets to make it look like a message, a hit. He literally walked away while his boss was trapped in the back, banging on the metal. When Elias was brought in for questioning, he didn't even break a sweat. He sat in the interrogation room, sipping stale coffee, and played the grieving employee perfectly, until the detectives slid a printout across the table. It was the telemetry data from the Mercedes. Modern cars, especially high-end ones, record everything. The data showed the trunk opening at 11:47 p.m. in the penthouse garage, and it showed the driver's seat weight sensor registering exactly 165 pounds Elias's exact weight for the 30-mile drive to Homestead. Elias just stared at the paper, The color completely drained from his face, the illusion shattered. The emotional aftermath of a case like this, it lingers. It sticks to the people who worked it. The lead detective later told a reporter that he couldn't sleep for months. Every time he closed his eyes, he thought about the sheer, suffocating panic Laurent must have felt in those final hours. A man who had the world at his fingertips, who flew first class and drank vintage champagne, reduced to clawing at carpet and rubber in the pitch black, sweating to death in a suburban parking lot. The case is closed now. Elias took a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He'll die in prison. But there's one final detail. One last piece of evidence that didn't make the evening news, but it's the thing that haunts me the most. Laurent was wearing an Apple Watch. When the cyber team pulled the biometric data from the device, they didn't just see his heart rate spiking in a state of absolute terror, they saw exactly when it stopped. Elias locked him in that trunk at 11:47 p.m. on Tuesday. But Laurent didn't die that night. The data showed his heart finally flatlined at exactly 3:14 p.m. on Wednesday afternoon. Which means Laurent was alive in that trunk, baking in the suffocating heat of the Florida sun for over 15 hours. The architecture of delusion. The Deschutes County case. There's something uniquely terrifying about losing trust in your own measurements. Not ghosts, not monsters, not some shadow moving in the corner of your room. I'm talking about the absolute collapse of your confidence in objective reality itself. The moment your tape measure says one thing, your eyes say another, and your brain quietly decides the world is no longer obeying the rules it's supposed to. That's what happened in Deschutes County, Oregon in the fall of 2019. And honestly, the reason this case still unsettles psychologists isn't because of violence or gore, it's because nothing supernatural happened at all. Everything had an explanation, but by the time the explanations arrived, two people had already destroyed their lives. It started with a 911 call on October 14th. The caller was calm, too calm. No screaming, no crying, just a man whispering, "You need to send someone, but tell them not to look at the trees. The geometry is wrong." Then the line disconnected. Deputies drove out to Pine Ridge Road, expecting a mental health crisis or maybe somebody high on meth. Rural Oregon law enforcement gets plenty of both. What they found instead was deeply strange. Every window of the house had been boarded shut from the inside. Not haphazardly either, carefully, methodically. 3-inch decking screws driven through thick plywood into the window frames, every seam sealed with duct tape to block outside light. The deputies had to breach the front door. Inside, the house was pitch black. David and Elena Miller were sitting cross-legged in the living room, wearing heavy polarized sunglasses despite the darkness. The walls were covered floor to ceiling in black marker equations. Thousands of them. Measurements, angles, ratios, distances repeated over and over again like ritualistic prayers. The couple claimed the dimensions of the house were shrinking. Not metaphorically, literally. They believed the hallways were narrowing by fractions of an inch every night. And for 4 straight months, they had barricaded themselves inside trying to map the collapse. To understand how two educated adults reached that point, you have to rewind to when everything still looked normal. David and Elena were the definition of an ordinary couple. David worked remotely as a logistics data analyst. Elena was a freelance graphic designer. In 2018, they bought a fixer-upper outside Bend, Oregon, a quiet property surrounded by dense pine forest and wet Pacific Northwest fog. Their digital history from that period is painfully mundane. Pinterest boards about bathroom tile, receipts from Home Depot, photos of their dog Buster rolling in fresh snow, arguments over paint colors, the kind of life so ordinary it almost hurts to look at afterward. The first disturbance appeared in late November after a snowstorm. David noticed a bright orange utility line spray-painted near the edge of the driveway. At first glance, it looked harmless, probably a county marking for underground cable work. But when David called the county office, they told him no work orders existed for Pine Ridge Road. That should have been the end of it. Instead, David measured the line's distance from the mailbox post, 14 feet, 2 inches. The next morning, he measured it again, 13 feet, 11 inches. Then 13 feet, 6 inches. He became obsessed. Every morning before sunrise, David shuffled outside in slippers, carrying a tape measure and notepad, recording distances while standing in freezing Oregon air. At first, Elena tried to stay rational, and honestly, she found a perfect explanation. Frost heave. When frozen ground shifts, fence posts and mailbox supports can subtly lean. Measuring from the top of a tilted mailbox post could absolutely create the illusion that a painted line was moving. It made total sense. For 3 days, David relaxed. They ordered pizza, watched movies, texted friends. The crisis appeared over. But delusions are dangerous precisely because they can survive temporary logic. A few days later, a winter thaw softened the ground and corrected the mailbox alignment entirely. That night, Elena woke up at 3:14 a.m. and found David crawling across the hallway floor with a laser measurer and Sharpie marker. He had drawn a coordinate grid directly onto the hardwood floorboards. "The driveway was the mailbox," he whispered. "But the hallway shouldn't change." Elena tried to calm him down. Then she picked up the laser measurer herself, 34 inches. That was the hallway width. Except Elena knew the hallway had originally been 38 inches wide. She remembered because she had bought a custom 36-inch runner rug that fit perfectly with 1 inch of hardwood exposed on each side. Now the rug was buckled violently upward against both baseboards. In that moment, her certainty shattered. That's the detail psychologists always focus on later. Not the faulty measurement, not David's paranoia, the rug. Because the human brain desperately trusts visual confirmation. And once Elena saw physical evidence supporting David's fear, she stopped being an outside observer and became part of the delusion. That's when the collapse accelerated. For 19 days, the couple vanished from normal life. Neighbors saw lights flickering at odd hours. Grocery deliveries piled up untouched. Their dog barked constantly inside the house. Meanwhile, David and Elena transformed the interior into a paranoid geometric map. Every wall measured, every hallway tracked, every angle recorded. They stopped trusting windows because they believed perspective distortion was infecting spatial relationships. They boarded the house shut to eliminate outside visual references. When Elena's sister finally entered the home weeks later, she described the atmosphere as physically oppressive. The smell of stale coffee, rotting takeout containers, human sweat, panic. She found them hiding in a bedroom closet, physically curled into themselves because they believed the ceiling was descending slowly enough to crush them over time. And here's the most horrifying part. Nothing in the house was actually wrong. The hallway hadn't narrowed, the walls hadn't shifted, the dimensions were unchanged. The entire nightmare hinged on 2 tiny failures stacking together at exactly the wrong moment. First, David had accidentally shoved a heavy console table sideways during one of his sleep-deprived episodes. The table leg snagged the hallway rug and bunched it upward against the baseboards, creating the illusion that the walls were squeezing inward. Second, the laser measurer was defective. A detective later tested it at the station and got wildly inconsistent readings. Dust contamination inside the optical sensor caused false measurements. That was it. A crooked rug, a broken measuring tool, and 2 exhausted people slowly feeding each other's fears in total isolation. The psychiatric diagnosis was folie à dos shared psychotic disorder. It's rare, but devastating. One person develops a delusion, and another emotionally dependent person gradually absorbs it until both operate inside the same false reality. David cracked first. Elena became the reinforcement system. Once both accepted the hallucination as objective truth, every new piece of evidence strengthened it further. That's the thing about the human brain. It does not experience reality directly. It builds reality. And once that construction process starts failing, logic becomes almost useless. David and Elena eventually recovered enough to function independently, but the relationship didn't survive. Friends later said they couldn't look at each other without remembering those 19 days trapped inside a reality that never existed. But the final detail in the case is what truly lingers. Months later, after therapy, investigators asked Elena a simple question. When did you finally realize the house wasn't shrinking? She thought about it for a long time before answering, and then she said something deeply unsettling. I still don't completely believe it wasn't.